My name is Alana Lentin, and I'm a founding collective member of the Institute for the Critical Studies of Zionism, and I'm also a professor at Western Sydney University. I'm joining you today from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'm very happy to have with me my co-organizer for today, Professor Barry Trachtenberg, who's the Rubin Presidential Chair of Jewish Studies at Wake Forest University, and also an academic advisory board of Jewish Voice for Peace, and of course, the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. We've got two esteemed guests to help us parse these ideas with us today. They are Aline Batarseh, who's Executive Director of Visualizing Palestine and co-editor of Visualizing Palestine, a chronicle of colonialism and the struggle for liberation, and Brooke Lober, who's a lecturer at UC Berkeley and at the Department of Gender and Women's Studies, on the Academic Council of Jewish Voice for Peace, and a faculty staff member of faculty and staff for justice in Palestine at UC Berkeley. So just a little bit about the two organizations that have invited you today. So firstly, the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism was formed about a year and a half ago. So I hope some of you at least know about us. We aim to support the delinking of the study of Zionism from Jewish studies and to reclaim academia and public discourse for the study of Zionism as a political, ideological, and racial and gendered knowledge project that intersects with Palestine and decolonial studies, critical terrorism studies, settler colonial studies, and so on. We approach Zionism as a broad set of colonial and repressive work and solidarities, efforts to curate knowledge and identities, and to dismantle movements that resisted. In other words, Zionism's project extends beyond the borders of Palestine, and we're trying to parse the way that happens. For more information on the Institute, you can visit criticalzionismstudies.org. Secondly, the Coalition to End Zionist Repression, which, as I'm sure you know, aims to combat attacks on people speaking out and organizing for Palestinian rights and against Zionism. And you can find more information about the coalition at righttorejectzionism.com/coalition. All right, so what brought us together to speak about definitions today? I don't think it's any news to anybody here that the adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism has, as Muhannad Ayyash wrote, hurt the Palestinian anti-colonial struggle and academic and advocacy freedom in untold ways. And I think many of us are living through the consequences of that today. So just yesterday, there was a scramble here in Australia because the Quango that sort of unites vice chancellors of Australian universities sat together and decided unilaterally that they were going to introduce a definition of anti-Semitism that's even more incoherent and worse in terms of repression, potentially for universities in Australia without any kind of consultation with anybody who actually belongs to the community of universities. And so Barry and I, in discussions around what we wanted to do, started to discuss the idea of whether or not definitions were something that were useful in any kinds of ways when they're adopted by universities that, as we know, are colonial and repressive institutions in and of themselves. However, in discussion with our wider community, we note that there are many people who have been working on alternative definitions of anti-Semitism, as well as definitions of Islamophobia, and of course, anti-Palestinian racism. And we wanted to discuss with our guests whether or not we thought that these were fruitful avenues. And so I thought I would start by asking some questions to each of the three speakers. So although I'm also somebody who's sort of thinking and writing about these things, I did prefer to be in a more chairing role today, but I might add my little ideas in along the way. And of course, there'll be room and time for everybody to ask questions at the end, either using the Q&A function, which is found when you press on more at the bottom of the screen, And you can already put them there and we can look at them later on. Or later on, if you prefer to speak, of course, I can unmute you and you can raise your hand in a normal way and speak and ask your question that way towards the end of the event, which will go for around an hour and a half. All right, so to everybody, I have a couple of general questions. The first one is, what do you think are the main challenges or dangers posed by the near universal adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism or similar kinds of definitions? So perhaps, who would like to start? Perhaps I would turn it over to Aline to start. Would that be all right?
Sure, yeah. So thank you for the kind introduction, Alana, and for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I guess first I'll say I think I'm the only non-academic on this call. So, so just naming that, and I think I'm also the only Palestinian participating on this call. And when I first got the invitation, I was like, you know, this is a difficult topic to address because obviously when we talk about the IRA definition, it's so problematic because there's conflation between what anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is. And as a Palestinian, I don't feel like I can talk about anti-Semitism, right? Because I don't experience it myself. But then when there is this weaponization of the term anti-Semitism, and what it means is that for us as Palestinians, there is an institutionalization of anti-Palestinian racism. There is a process of making Palestinian historical narrative illegitimate. There is a negation of Palestinian identity when this conflation happens. And IRA has basically been used as a weapon by legacy Jewish organizations who have a political agenda, right? They're not concerned about actual anti-Semitism and the fact that it has roots in the Western world and that it's steeped in white supremacy. They're really just interested in negating Palestinian experience. And I think that's the main challenge for us, right? Because what ends up happening is that as Palestinians or people who support Palestinian liberation, we find ourselves in a position where we are defending ourselves for calling out Israeli oppression rather than focusing on ending that oppression, right? And so we are already dealing with so much loss, so much grief, and especially, and obviously IRA was introduced way before October 7th. But since then, what we find ourselves doing when we're out in the streets or when we're calling out oppression is, especially in places like the US, is that we are automatically being called anti-Semitic, right? If any Palestinian or a person that's supporting Palestinian rights speaks about this oppression, you just have to say Palestine and you're already automatically anti-Semitic. So this is the framework that's so problematic because we're working towards ending oppression. We're working towards calling out oppression. We're working towards talking about our experiences as Palestinians, and then automatically we are being smeared, right, by this definition being used to suppress us and our narratives. So that's the main issue that we have, and that's the main challenges and dangers that this poses, both for Palestinians or anyone who wants to talk about Palestinian oppression. And we're seeing this at every level, right? We're seeing this in the media, we're seeing this in schools, in universities, in the streets, and it's becoming more and more problematic. Because it completely cancels us out and it cancels our experiences. So this is where I would start with just how dangerous it is. And I think, there are so many people who want to speak out about what's happening in Palestine and can't because they're afraid of being smeared as anti-Semitic. And there are so many examples all around us. And I think, one of the contributions that Visualizing Palestine has had, and we can talk about this a little bit later, is, a series of visuals of what anti-Palestinian racism is, right? Because what's ended up happening is, by being smeared as anti-Semitic, we're actually just seeing a complete erasure and canceling out of what it means to be Palestinian, what it means to experience oppression. And we wanted to really bring attention. It's not really a definition, it's more of a framework of what does it look, to be racist against Palestinians and Palestinian allies. I will stop there, and yeah, we can expand on this a little bit more.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated that distinction between a framework and a definition. And I really find that kind of a fruitful way to think about this, because of course we need language to explain the particularities of different forms of racism. But defining something also closes it down and doesn't recognize, as we know also as scholars and scholars of race and people who experience racism, that race doesn't sit in its place. It constantly morphs and changes, and we need to be able to move with it in our explanatory capability. So thank you. And we'll hear a little bit more from you later on about the particular work of Visualizing Palestine. So perhaps, Brooke, if you're ready to answer the first question.
Sure. Well, I mean, I really agree with everything that Aline said, and thank you for bringing in the issue of anti-Palestinian racism that's exacerbated by the accusation of anti-Semitism against Palestinian people and against all of the allies, right, with the Palestinian cause. I think that is, when we're asking like, what is the most challenging. Clearly that's the one. And it's the racist, it adds to a situation where racism is already in place. And that is the anti-Palestinian racism, but also, everything from the classic Orientalism that affects, many, many different people, who's, have heritage from the Middle East or who are from the Middle East, Arab people, and also Muslim people who may not even be from the Middle East, right? Because those kinds of associations converge. So this, I think the IRA definition and everything that's like it, right, sort of castigates all of those people actually in very classic Orientalist fashion in many ways. And that is the principal danger. There are additional dangers, including the criminalization of dissent. So all kinds of political dissent actually come under a sort of microscope that's then connected to this very politicized accusation of anti-Semitism. And in that maneuver, in that criminalization of dissent, we talk about the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And Dylan Rodriguez goes further to talk about this as a form of counterinsurgency, right? As a political maneuver that actually is produced to, right, disempower actually many elements of dissent, right? That include, but actually are not limited to even the Palestine solidarity movement. And I think that we see that in, and I'll talk about this more, but we see that in some current efforts, right? And that includes, so I'll name and kind of introduce that the Project Esther document that was created by the Heritage Foundation, a Christian nationalist foundation, goes far beyond, right? It both criminalizes, it proposes the criminalization and the dismantlement of the Palestine solidarity movement, but it goes far, far beyond that to accuse, people who are involved with the Palestine solidarity movement, not only of being terrorist supporters, but also of being anti-American. And it really invokes this, what's being called a new McCarthyism. So I think that there's so many repressive scripts that are kind of codified by this, the seed of it, or the, one kind of springboard for it is this accusation of anti-Semitism that really has, it has a little bit of a longer history than IRA. It actually comes out of late 20th century kinds of a sort of reformation of a white kind of nationalist understanding of the threat, right, of an anti-racist left. So in so many ways, it actually takes a part of that entire, it takes a very clear part in that entire political maneuver. I can talk about that a little bit more, but I think, another thing that I want to mention is that we're in this moment where, as we see this exceptional narrative around anti-Jewish prejudice, we're also seeing the allowance and even the, encouragement of all kinds of other forms, not only of racism, but also of sexism, misogyny, and queer and transphobia. And so while we see the kind of incitement of all of those forms of hatred, we see the prohibition, right, around anti-Semitism. And I think that exceptionalizing alone also not only leaves us unable to address anti-Semitic racism because we start to lack the language for it, but it even produces a fetishized anti-Semitism. And we see that in the white nationalist right's fetishization of Nazism, right? And I think that seems really clear. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
These are such valuable points. Thank you. And so knitting so many different things together. So I really appreciate the richness of what you brought there. Okay, Barry, turn over to you.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Alon, for doing so much of the heavy lifting and getting this webinar together. And I'm so grateful we have this opportunity at long last to talk through some of these issues. Not to say I've learned a lot from your own speaking and writing on this. So some of what I'll be saying is informed by that, and also my work with Brooke, and been so impressed with so many of the visuals from Visualizing Palestine. I don't know if you can see them here. I've been so overwhelmed by them. I have the one on anti-Palestinian racism on my office door and in my office window. I think it's so valuable, but it also raises these questions for me about definitions, right? The need to define these terms, and then also the limits of them. So I'll just say, in addition to these incredible points that we've already heard, which I fully agree with, I'll just add some other thoughts. The widespread dissemination of the IRA definition, and now these, I guess, enhanced definitions that we're seeing, through Project Esther, through a lot of what you're saying is coming out now and being imposed upon Australian universities, what we're seeing in Germany and other spaces. It's just obviously of enormous concern. I think it serves several functions that we have to pay attention to, none of which have anything to do with actually making Jewish lives safer, right? I think we just need to be clear about that, or really anyone's lives safer as a result. I mean, and these definitions, what they do is they evacuate the meaning of the term anti-Semitism. As someone who's coming out of Jewish studies, my field is modern European Jewish history, where we look at the origins of where anti-Semitism came out of, how it comes out of earlier strands of anti-Jewish hatred that had existed in Europe for religious and structural reasons for so long. These definitions just evacuate the meaning of anti-Semitism whatsoever, and what they do is they equate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel, that they just equate these two. And what that does is it gives white supremacists a pass, right? It removes them from that equation almost entirely. And of course, the actual lived violence that Jews have experienced, say, in American history, where I'm located, has been almost entirely from white supremacists. Like that's, thinking just in more recent years, the Tree of Life shooting that occurred, other attacks on Jewish communities. I mean, this is where it's coming from. But those people are given a pass because they get protection by the state, because their interests are in line with those who are in state power. What these definitions also do is they divorce anti-Semitism from other manifestations of oppression, of racial oppression, of national oppression, religious oppression that exists in the world. And so it reinforces this notion of Jewish exceptionalism, that Jews are a people apart from the world, that Jews are fundamentally different from the world. And it elevates that idea rather than seeks to counter that idea, because of course it's the notion that Jews are fundamentally incommensurate with the societies in which they reside, which is at the root of anti-Semitism. But these definitions don't address any of that, and it's not only the language of the definition, but in how the definitions are actually written into policy and then how those policies are enforced, right? Because I think we'd be all very, very hard pressed to find a single instance of a university or a governmental authority pointing to the IRA definition to attack neo-Nazis, to attack Christian nationalists, to attack white supremacists. I don't think we would find that anywhere. And the reason for that's quite simple. That's not the point of the definition. That's not what it's there to do. That is not why it is adopted by institutions. I think we also have to acknowledge that the function of these definitions is in large part to drive a wedge into university settings and into other institutions so that they can begin the process of dismantling these institutions. And so much of the work that people have done over the last 30 years, really over much of my lifetime, to bring in ethnic studies programs, to bring in women's resource centers, LGBTQ centers, women in gender and sexuality studies programs, Black studies, Chicana studies, all of this work will be undone through the introduction. So it's really sort of serves this function as a wedge, sort of using the mantle of combating anti-Semitism to undo all of these programs. It's problematic, these debates around all of these different programs and different institutions. There's obviously serious criticisms of, say, DEI programs that come from the left, but also many people have benefited from them, right? And so there needs to be conversations about these and not just the whole on dismantling them and just leaving all the people who've been served by these in the lurch. But again, that's the goal of this. So I'll say that as someone who had a role in helping to shape the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which was one of the several attempts to sort of roll back the force of the IRA definition to sort of throw a stone under that wheel. I will say I think we're at the point where now competing definitions are not going to save us. I think it was a strategy that had some limited uses, also had significant problems that maybe that's something we could address here or some other time. But we have to acknowledge that the IRA definition and really so much of the institutional struggle against anti-Semitism is a project that props up state power, that it props up capitalism and is propping up empire. But simultaneously, accusations of anti-Semitism that are being made in defense of Israel serve exactly the same goals. So if we say witness, for example, the Sig Heils of Elon Musk and Steve Bannon in recent weeks, and then the defenses of these gestures by groups like the Anti-Defamation League or commentators like Barry Weiss and others, it's shocking, right? That there's this mirroring or maybe duality between the struggle against anti-Semitism and at the same time the weaponization of anti-Semitism accusations that are making it very, very clear to us the way in which that white supremacy and Zionism are two projects that are utterly linked with one another, that they're completely intertwined with one another. And they have both, and with these definitions, they have so far been very, very successful at coming up with a strategy to prevent Palestinians from speaking about their experiences, to prevent actually any real work being done on to combat anti-Semitism. And I think that, among the tasks for us is to figure out what's next and sort of where do we go from here. Thanks.
Thank you, Barry. And I think, to complete this first round of questions, I think so many different strands have been brought together. And it really kind of segues really nicely, especially your last remarks there, Barry, into the next question that I have. And thinking about what you raised, Brooke, in terms of Dylan Rodriguez's formulation of the university as well as a counterinsurgent force, and how institutions like universities, the university is like a microcosm of these projects, I think. So all of us, apart from Aline, are working for better or for worse within universities, so we see it up close and personal. But definitely, I think they provide that prototype that can be so easily rolled out, by other institutions as well. And that's why they're interesting to focus on, not because the university is in itself a more interesting space necessarily, but there are also the spaces in which DEI and other forms of programs have been trialed to some relative success, but also in many ways in a counterinsurgent way to contain and domesticate more radical forms of dissent. And so in a sense, despite the fact that those structures are now being overturned, that kind of mechanism of domestication and that kind of installation of a culture of fear, that something will be taken away from you if you don't acquiesce to the needs of the institution, that's already set in place a kind of a baseline upon which to build for this next terrifying stage, because so many colleagues are rightly or wrongly fearful of what will happen to them individually within this kind of neoliberal approach to diversity that's been so much propagated, but also colluded with by communities of such as university academics and so on. So that makes me think of my second question. And this is a little bit of a self-interested one, because I've spent the last while writing this book, which actually takes up a lot of the themes. I promise you I'm not doing a plug, but sort of am. Takes up a lot of the themes that we've been discussing, particularly in the last chapter, which I actually named Against Definitions, thanks to Barry, because I don't know how we started talking about it, but we came up with this name for the webinar idea a really long time ago, and then I had to go away and write my chapter on this, and then so obviously I had a good name, which I hope works. But it really made what I'm trying to do in that work. The book is on different things, but this particular chapter there's one chapter which looks very much at these kind of counterinsurgent actions that we've been trying to deal with, but from a perspective of Black and Indigenous and colonized resistance. There's another chapter that looks at kind of indigenizing initiatives within universities and how these have been weaponized in conjunction with the notion of Jewish indigeneity to Palestine. And then this last chapter, Against Definitions, really tries to think through whether or not institutions are spaces that can be purposefully used or used in such a way that can ever be liberatory. So if we were to include definitions of other forms of racism that sit alongside definitions or better definitions of anti-Semitism, can these institutions, with all of the caveats that we've just named about them, ever be spaces in which these forms of racism can be adequately recognized and dealt with? So the second question I formulated in such a way, which is, do you think that institutions such as, but not only obviously universities, need definitions of distinct forms of racism that aren't already covered by general understandings, which, as I said earlier, are evolving, of these different forms of racism, and also laws that already exist? So one of the remarks from the Cantor Center, which is at Tel Aviv University, which developed or worked very much on the IRA definition, actually admitted that they don't really need an additional definition of anti-Semitism, because many of these laws already cover what's at stake here. So it's interesting that nonetheless we're seeing this rollout of these definitions, meaning that, as Barry correctly said, these definitions are not at all about actually protecting anybody from anti-Semitism, quite the contrary. All right, so should we go in the same order again? Is that all right? I'll turn over to you, Aline.
Sure, yeah, thank you. I think so much has been said already, so I'll be picking up on some of the points that Barry and Brooke made as well. And yourself, Ilana, including around issues of safety, right? If these definitions are supposed to make people safe, then it's really important that we look at how all of our safety is interconnected, right? And I think the fundamental issue with, especially if we want to talk about the IRA definition or any definition that is weaponized to suppress or to censor any group or to make them cancel out a part of who they are and a part of their history, or to criminalize their identity, then that is not a helpful definition, right? That makes everyone actually very unsafe. Because if I, as a Palestinian, for example, I'm not able to talk about my experiences, my upbringing, my interaction with colonization, then my experience is being erased, my identity is being erased. So I don't necessarily think, and this is such a, when I saw the question, I thought it was such an interesting question and a difficult question, because I do think that language is important. I think that definitions could be useful, but I also think that some definitions are really more about power than they're about language, right? Who is putting the definitions out there? And how are these definitions being used and by whom, right? And I think this is the fundamental issue here, is that we've had, organizations that have had immense political power that have used definitions to harm communities. And if we want to talk about how all of our safety is interrelated. Like, is there a definition on anti-Black racism? Is there a definition of what it is to be anti-trans or anti-immigrant? And, it's really, it's kind of endless, the definitions that we can have. And they're not necessarily unuseful, but I think, I think the problem is with the definitions that we're talking about, and specifically here, the IRA definition, is that it is actually used to silence, so that's what I would go back to, from my perspective. I think that's what's important. And I feel like, organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, and Barry, you're involved with them, of course, I feel like they've put out definitions that are actually quite useful. They put out a definition on anti-Semitism that's useful. They've put out, a question about what is anti-Zionism that is very useful, and how, anti-Semitism is not anti-Zionism. And in the definition on anti-Semitism, they talk about how our safety is bound together. And I think that's really the most fundamental, most important part of, any definition, if we want it to be useful. Is that realization, right? As long as we're harming someone by a definition that we put out there, then it's really not useful. It's problematic. It is, it's going to put all of us actually in danger, because it takes away, Barry, you talked about, actual anti-Semitic acts that have been caused by white supremacists in the US. These are not being addressed, right? And the focus is on something else entirely, because of this, the politicization, and because there are powerful groups whose interests are not really to the benefit of any of the communities that are actually facing racism, or facing real acts of racism. I don't know if that's useful. So that would be the gist of my answer.
Thanks so much. Brooke?
Yeah, I think, and thank you, Aline, for talking about the ways that, anti-Palestinian racism is really shored up in some ways by these definitions. And I think that's the thing, is that we just have to say that appears to be an intentional aspect of what's going on in these university-based and other kinds of institutional definitions. It doesn't look like a good faith act to defend Jewish people, who experience prejudice in so many ways. And we could give a lot of examples of that. I think that one of the things that your question brings me to is the problem of punitivity and punitive justice. So I think that it actually makes me think about the processes through which experiences of violence or prejudice are addressed in universities and in other institutions. And one thing I can say, we've been kind of talking about exceptionalism. It really just looks like, from the experience of being at universities for the last couple of years, it looks like there's a very concerted attack on the Palestine movement. And that's not only around the accusation of anti-Semitism, but actually many other ways of breaking rules or things like that that are just routinely ignored in other circumstances. So we have all of these students who are going through conduct processes, because they're supposedly being accused of acts of anti-Semitism or other kinds of rule breaking, vandalism, things like that. But how many, frat parties result in rule breaking, in vandalism, in other kinds forms of prejudice, and they're actually routinely ignored. So I think that the institutionalization of definitions leads us to a question for me of punitivity. But I think that the point that Barry made earlier about DEI initiatives, and this isn't the only place, but when we think about, rather than thinking about the institutionalization of definitions, just thinking about the institutionalization of anti-racism, or thinking about the institutionalization of anti-sexism. What does it look like for institutions to adopt, right, anti-racist, anti-sexist, philosophies and ideologies? It shouldn't only be punitivity. It should also be the production of cultures of anti-racism, anti-sexism, and of, for example, queer and trans life. I can say that at UC Berkeley, we had Turning Point USA, a nationalist, often considered a white nationalist organization, come to campus, also at Sonoma State, another campus where I teach. And they hold events called things like Eradicate Transgender. How is it possible that that is approved by the administration? In some cases, administrators even attend these events, and that is allowable while, a student calling out Free Palestine or Intifada is mischaracterized as anti-Semitism and therefore prohibited. I think that the very problem of prohibition, what's being prohibited and what's being allowed, if we're going to trace this, we see the investments, very clearly. I also want to say that there's a long history of, especially in my experience, right, queer and trans people opposing the ways that prejudice against them is misused for racist ends, right? And the same thing has happened, of course, historically in feminism, right? So the accusation of sexism against minoritized communities or communities of color is very clearly used to criminalize and produce forms of punitivity. We could look at egregious cases like the case of the Central Park Five, and there are many, 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 many more. So when we look at the misuse of these kinds of accusations of anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia, for shoring up power, for racist ends, right, in order to criminalize and vilify particular populations, this isn't new. And it looks like that's what's happening. So in terms of, I would move us towards actually anti-racist education, ethnic studies, anti-sexist education, feminist studies. And I'll just say that in my own research, I've been really interested in a feminist practice that comes from the grassroots of very long conversations and contestations and debates about what constitutes anti-Semitism, what constitutes racism, but actually those conversations and debates taking place among people who, and this is a fractious issue over time, but some of whom actually want to produce solidarities across complex difference and want to produce shared understandings of anti-Semitism, racism, and actually many other forms of prejudice, including Orientalism, Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism. And sometimes, in the best of cases, we might actually converge on an understanding. So I think that from my perspective in feminist studies, feminist studies has come through about a 30 or a 40-year conversation about Zionism and anti-Zionism from 1975, when before the UN declared anti-Zionism to be a form of racism, the Women's Conference at the UN, which took place in Mexico City, converged on naming anti-Zionism, among other, acts as a form of racism. There's been a debate and a conversation over 40 years. And I think that one thing that's meaningful is that in as much as that conversation can be not punitive, we can actually come to a shared understanding that Palestine is a feminist issue, right? Which is something that not only did the Palestinian Feminist Collective, name that a few years ago, but women's studies and gender studies programs across the country signed on to that, not as a definition, but as a shared concern, which I think is much more, has the potential to last, right? And is a much longer and more complex conversation. I'll leave it at that. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for that. That's so important, I think, because this is ultimately what we're talking about, communities of people struggling together to define their own experiences and to resist oppression. But as all of you have rightly pointed out, this is what is being attacked with the institutionalization of definitions of anti-Semitism as a form of exceptionalized racism, not only as a form, but as the only form of actual racism, which actually creates racism as something that exists outside of the structures of the state, outside of the structures of colonialism, which are, of course, not even named. One of the things that you also led me to think about, both of you, is the fact that we, constantly were subjected to this notion that anybody who struggled against queerphobia, racism, sexism, and so on were precious snowflakes who couldn't stand debate and needed to be coddled, in the words of, I think it was Jonathan Haidt or one of these other creatures. And now, all of a sudden, the same people are advocating for freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and academic freedom to be trampled on for the reasons of maintaining power. So that's another thing that I think we contend with. As I always say, my mantra is the hypocrisy is the point. So pointing out hypocrisy is kind of utterly useless. However, it is interesting to think about what it means, for example, for Bezos to come out the other day and say that from now on, the Washington Post will only be allowed to write opinions that that promote the idea of freedom, but actually that in itself is repressive, because firstly, he doesn't define what he means by that, but secondly, also we know what kind of attitudes or what kinds of opinions are going to be allowable and which are not. In fact, I was asked on that very a personal responsibility, Julia is saying, I was asked on that very day by a journalist from the Washington Post to give a comment for an article she was writing about the notion of so-called white genocide and how, and the proposal from Musk to allow white South African farmers to have refugee status in the United States, something that was already proposed by the leader of the opposition party, Peter Dutton, in this country several years ago. Because, of course, in matters of racism, Australia always does it first, and they always do it better. And then I woke up to the news that Bezos has made this declaration. I'm thinking that article is never going to be published, or at least not with any of the comments that I gave. Anyway, that's an aside. So yes, Barry, I'll turn over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you. I don't really have too much to add to all of these comments, other than to say that in my most pessimistic moments, which I spent a lot of time in over the last 16 months, I'm increasingly just coming to sort of understand that what we're striving towards and asking for of our universities, at least here in the American context, but I suspect it's true in Australia, and you correct me, in these various settler colonial states, is that these institutions are so fully embedded in with the systems of oppression and dependent upon that to look to them as sites for transformation rather than sites of struggle. I just feel pessimistic in these moments. So I'm thinking, most immediately of my own university, Wake Forest in North Carolina. And This is an elite private institution. Prior to that, I was at a public university in upstate New York, um, which is a very, very different kind of institution as part of the SUNY system. Um, but regardless, both types of institutions in different ways are just fully embedded in these systems of white supremacy. And just taking the case example, the case study of Wake Forest, it's a university that was founded with money from the sale of enslaved Blacks. It was an institution that had sided with the Confederacy in the American Civil War. Um, it's an institution that was a forerunner of eugenics research and eugenicist policy making. It's a university that participated, fully in segregation and Black codes in the American South. It's a university that currently and historically has engaged in the gentrification and displacement of Black communities. So to expect a place like this, which has the motto pro humanitate, sort of for all humans, right, for all humanity, to I know you're shaking your head, to that in any way just feels like this Herculean task, that we're just fighting against these structures. I mean, since World War II, it's been funded by Reynolds Tobacco money. Right. So, I mean, just the poisoning and deaths of, I'm sure hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Right. It's like responsible for the office that I'm in right now, for the scholarship that I'm doing, for the fact that I can participate in this webinar at all. So that's like the structures within which we're working. And yeah, so that's just where I'm at. And so that's what we're trying to fight. And so like finding those places, those cracks, I think is what we have to do. Like find those alliances, find those solidarities, find those weaknesses. Maybe call them out on the hypocrisy, just because to not do that would seem irresponsible. But find every one of those cracks that we can in order to create our own wedges to really do the work to transform the institution. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And these are such important points. I mean, the paradox of us being sort of within these institutions where we have been able to do so much, but which at the same time are responsible for these structures of power, is something that is worth naming, I think. Okay, so for the final round of questions, I thought of two specific questions, well, a specific question for both Aline and Brooke, to do with the particular nature of your local work and the work that you do at Berkeley, Brooke, or within your organizing, and Aline, of course, within Visualizing Palestine. We heard a little bit already about the framework and the visuals that you've produced, so I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And I also thought it would be good, yes, to address the challenges that you both face, but also have there been any breakthroughs or hopeful moments or times that you can share with us, because I think that's really important for our ongoing resistance. And after you've both answered these questions, I'll open it up to the floor. There is already one question in the Q&A and one question in the chat. All right, so over to you, Aline.
Thank you, Alana. And Barry, as you were talking about, those sites not being sites of transformation, it just, triggered so much because in addition to my work at Visualizing Palestine, I've been struggling with our public school system where we live, where last year and this year students organized several walkouts, and we're talking about high school students here, so not even at the university level, but we know that it starts from the school system, right? And last year they were told by the principal that words like apartheid, genocide, siege are all anti-Semitic. And when the students were challenging her on that, she said, "You don't define those, they have already been defined." So these are the institutions that we are struggling against. And this year, when we were talking to the superintendent about, falsely accusing our students of anti-Semitism, she sent a letter back saying, these are such complex issues, when we talk about Israel and its neighbors and the conflict between them. And I'm like, what Israel and its neighbors? Like, what are you talking about? Not in one, there wasn't a single place where Palestinians were mentioned in that letter. And this is the degree of erasure, and this is how steeped in anti-Palestinian racism these institutions are, is that they don't even recognize that they're being racist because they're just it's so entrenched, right? Anyway, on that note, I'll shift to visualizing Palestine, and just in case people on this call don't know what we do, we were established in 2012. And we really basically, the idea of visualizing Palestine was to take the vast amount of data and resources that already exist on Palestine and the research. It's like, we always say it's one of the most heavily researched contexts really in the world. But the co-founders back then, Juman al-Jabri and Ramzi Jaber, wanted to take this data and to visually communicate it. And our mission basically is to use data and research to visually communicate Palestinian experiences to provoke narrative change. So over the years, we have worked a lot on the topic of repression. It's been one of the topics that we keep going back to. But one of the things that VP does is really, we look at some of those stories that have been invisible, to people who haven't been experiencing them. And a few years ago, we really wanted to hone in on the issue of suppression of dissent, because obviously the suppression of dissent started even before October 7th, as we all know. And we noticed that, the louder Palestinian calls for freedom were getting, that Israel and its allies were using, every tactic possible to muzzle dissent. So, from bans on Palestinians waving flags to arrests of Palestinians, in Palestine who dare speak out about genocide, to prohibiting boycotts, to targeting journalists, to mainstream media's complicity, to false accusations of anti-Semitism. All of these are interrelated issues. And the very first visual that we produced when we decided to focus on this theme a couple of years ago, and I will tell you, I have completely lost track of time since October 2023. I don't remember what year we're in or what month we're in a lot of the times. But the very first visual we produced was titled The System of Silencing. And in that visual, we bring attention to all the actors and the tactics that are used to silence dissent. And we look at the Israeli government, we look at the Palestinian Authority, we look at funders, universities, the media, and of course, the Israeli lobby. And even in that summary visual, we already talk about, the weaponization of anti-Semitism to silence dissent in these different spaces. So that's when we started to work on this issue. And then over the past few years as a team, we've really been discussing, how do we bring attention to this criminalization of even being Palestinian, and there was this discussion within our team around, should we do a visual on the conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? And as a team that focuses on Palestinian narratives, we didn't feel like that was our specialization or our role. Our role is to really amplify Palestinian narratives and to bring attention to those. So in the past, in the past few months, actually, in November, December, we decided to bring attention to the framing of anti-Palestinian racism. And this framing was actually first put out by the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association in April 2022. So really, they're the ones who came up with this framing, and the Institute for the Understanding of Anti-Palestinian Racism has also been working on research, specifically on how anti-Palestinian racism manifests. And I think the one important aspect of that is that we talk about how anti-Palestinian racism impacts Palestinians, but also impacts allies, right? And that's why it is a broader, it's a broader framing. It's not necessarily a definition, but it's a framework that we're looking at. And so in addition to the anti-Palestinian framework, anti-Palestinian racism framework that we put out, we also worked on several other visuals that look at the manifestation of anti-Palestinian racism in schools, in K-12 schools, in the media, and on college campuses. And we're thinking about, we've been thinking about looking at how anti-Palestinian racism also manifests in the workplace. So these are all places where we have very clear case studies. Unfortunately, there isn't like a comprehensive study that, where people are reporting some of those abuses, but there are lots of case studies and out there that we use to inform the visuals. And I think one thing I will say about, in case people on this call have not looked at the visuals, the anti-Palestinian racism framework. We look at mainly, the erasure of the Palestinian narrative. That's the main focus, right? And then we look at the framework, which includes Nakba denial, includes failing to acknowledge Palestinians as an indigenous people, includes violence or justification of violence against Palestinians. It includes dehumanization, which is basically the erasing the human rights and dignity of Palestinians. And then the fifth area is denying, distorting, or silencing Palestinian narratives. And so this is, the framework that we wanted to amplify. It's not a VP framework; it's the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association framework, and we really wanted to amplify it at a time when people don't have the language, right, to speak about what it means to experience this type of racism, which is being used to silence and to erase identity and history. So in terms of challenges, I think, Ilana, it's such a difficult question to answer, because to me the challenges have to do more with just the weight of the moment that we're in. And I think that's true for a lot of our colleagues. We haven't really processed any of the grief that we're experiencing and that we continue to experience, and the fear of what's coming next. I mean, Barry, you said that, this is not the most hopeful moment, and I agree. We're in a very, it's very difficult to watch what's happening and to feel hope. And at the same time, we need the hope to continue to do the work. And also we can't give up, right? We owe it to Palestinians on the ground to continue to challenge the system of oppression that we're all experiencing. So I think that's the most challenging part for us, is to, to sort of fight off that fear, that grief, basically, and to continue to do the work that we do. But it's also the source of hope, right? It's the hope is in the way that people are utilizing these visuals, in the way that these visuals are giving people tools to talk about the oppression, to challenge the oppression, to have the courage to speak out. And especially when they see others speaking out, even under immense repression and oppression, people are not giving up, and they continue to speak up, right? Sometimes at a very, very high cost, from doxing to emotional burden, to losing sleep over, all the harassment that people are getting, and some people losing their livelihood or even getting imprisoned for speaking out. So to me, the hope is from the stories that we hear from people about how important those visuals have been for the work that they're doing, for the organizing that they're doing. And this is actually why VP exists to begin with. We exist to be in service for the community, so that we're giving our community and the larger movement and also other movements tools to talk about Palestine, to educate about Palestine, to organize about Palestine. And this is the source of hope for us, that people continue to utilize those tools and they continue to be useful.
Thank you so much. And I think this is exactly this time, which is only this phase of Israel's genocide on the Palestinians, to have to do this work at the same time as you're experiencing the utter horror of this genocide. I mean, it's incredible that you do it, and it's so important that you do it. And it's very important for us to name and acknowledge this utter terror that is ongoing. Before I ask Brooke, I mean, what you raise is interesting to me. I was asked with my colleague, Debbie Bargali, I'm just going to hold it up, to create this booklet. Well, we created it as a booklet. It's called Key Concepts and Definitions for Building Racial Literacy. And we were asked to do it by the Commissioner for Racial Equality in this country. And it was very interesting because at first they were going to publish it, and then later on they decided not to publish it, which I won't get into. But the point is that it includes a definition of anti-Semitism, which says that anti-Semitism is European, and specifically, historically and contemporarily Western phenomenon. But it also includes a definition of anti-Palestinian racism, Islamophobia. And what I have noticed is, with all of the criticisms that we can have of these state-sanctioned structures to do anti-racism work, and the difficulties with those, and some of their internal politics, which are very detrimental actually to Palestinian organizing. At the same time, the commissioner, the Race Discrimination Commissioner, has explicitly named anti-Palestinian racism as a phenomenon, which I like to think it's not due to this booklet, but it is due to the wider activism out of which this booklet obviously stems. So I think doing this work is important to at least adding something to the narrative, if not completely changing it. So thank you so much for the work that you do. Brooke, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Aline. It's really great to see that visual. And I also just want to say some thanks, like thank you for the work that you do with visualizing Palestine. I've used it for so many years in classroom and also in movement spaces. The visuals that you all create are so well researched and so beautiful. They're so beautifully rendered and they're so moving. The work is really profound. And I also want to say thank you to the Institute for the Critical Studies of Zionism, because I think I didn't do that before. And I just want to say thank you for your organizing and creating platforms like this. It's really, it really is a huge change. You know, when I was a graduate student, I can't tell you how many conversations I had with professors and even administrators of funds, right, who said, I don't know if you should mention Palestine in your dissertation, and, you know, trying to take that out and trying to figure out, am I even saying anything? So now I'm just talking about debates among feminists. I don't even know what I'm talking about if I can't mention that this was actually about Zionism and this was actually about Palestine, right? So to actually have an academic institute organize itself around the study of Zionism really means a lot. And I'm grateful for that. And so as long as I'm saying thank yous, now I want to shift and say thank you to folks that I've been working with in the Jewish Voice for Peace Academic Council, because this question about what we've been doing, I just want to focus a little bit on our response to the Project Esther document that was created by the Heritage Foundation. So along with Barry, who I'm here with today, Barry Trachtenberg, I'm going to thank Benjamin Balthasar, Laura Goldblatt, Judith Butler, Jonah Rubin, Ashley Borer, Atalia Omar, and others who all contributed to a kind of extended period of study of the Heritage Foundation's document Project Esther, and we've produced a response to that we're going to publish soon. And we also want it to go out to activist networks, not only in the form of a piece of writing, but also in a kind of reckoning with the repressive state, right, in a moment when it is actually heightening its abilities to criminalize and control and deport, right? So that entire anti-immigrant threat is absolutely a part of the current picture of state repression that we're trying to focus on and understand the way that it's not only using, but so clearly misusing images of Jewish people and claims around anti-Semitism. So the work that we've done there is really to just read that document, which people can read from the Heritage Foundation, and to try to understand it, right? So it makes its claim to defending Jewish people, but it actually doesn't address anti-Semitism at all. Like I would say that anti-Semitism does not appear in the document. The document is about attacking the Palestine Solidarity Movement, criminalizing and it actually has a plan to not only to make the movement illegal and to charge it, right, with very serious charges that have been used against leftists in the past, the RICO Act specifically. So this is an act that was created ostensibly to prosecute mafias, right? And so racketeering, right, is racketeering and conspiracies. And so in naming the Palestine Solidarity Movement as a criminal network that they accuse of being a terror support network, so they actually call it, they abbreviate it with HSN, so the Hamas Support Network. And they accuse specific organizations, Jewish Voice for Peace, American Muslims for Palestine, and Students for Justice in Palestine of being this conspiracy, this criminal conspiracy. And I think that, and so then they also produce these associations between anti-Zionism, which they misname as anti-Semitism, and anti-Americanism and terrorism. So a plot to take down America is really what they outline here. They actually compare the Palestine Solidarity Movement historically to groups like the KKK, which feels extremely egregious, right? Because what they're saying there is that they're accusing the Palestine Solidarity Movement, really a movement that's aligned around anti-colonialism and human rights, right? They actually accuse that movement of being a purveyor of violence. Again, like obstructing actual histories of violence right here in the US that actually are about white supremacist and anti-Semitic groups like the KKK, right? So they do that, and then they also accuse the movement whole cloth of, right, this accusation of bringing down America, which they don't really define. I think what's been important about our work here has just been that we can analyze and trace this narrative, that we can produce an understanding of it, and also that we can displace that narrative and offer our own narrative. I think one of the things that I'm cautiously hopeful about is that people might begin to focus on actually the ways that these scripts themselves, so if we're looking at a white nationalist and Christian nationalist organization like the Heritage Foundation's work, that it is anti-Semitic, right? And actually, one of the things that Barry, I think, did so well when we were working together was to show that the way that these conspiracy theories themselves, this conspiracy theory about the Palestine Solidarity Movement actually mimics historical anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So it retains that same structure, that same paranoid structure of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory historically. And we actually just saw Bannon come out and say this in very simple terms. And what he said was, for MAGA, MAGA is a partner to Israel, and the real threat are anti-Zionist Jews. And the way that he said it was so obviously anti-Semitic, calling anti-Zionist Jews the enemy within. And I think he said behind the wire, they're inside the wire. And he said it over and over again. So this paranoid idea of an enemy within is such a dangerous narrative. And actually, what I'm, again, cautiously hopeful about, but within the Palestine Solidarity Movement, I think that we see very clearly, especially from the perspective of Jewish people within the Palestine Solidarity Movement, that Zionism is anti-Semitic. And the accusations against us that have come from Zionist quarters that homogenize Jews and put us on the outside of our own communities, right? Our own ethnic heritage, our own narratives of survival are silenced And actually, those themselves are, folded into what they are calling anti-Semitic racism, the Palestine movement, and how truly nefarious that is, and how frightening that is in an era of rising white supremacy and Christian hegemony, and the ways that actually, classic anti-Semitism absolutely has not gone away. And these definitions pull us away from understanding that. But and we can talk more about kinds of anecdotal evidence, right, that also shows this. So I guess that's a little bit of our work is in, right, displacing this narrative that the Heritage Foundation is doing. And I think, if I can talk about any other local work, just watching this unfold on university campuses, again, like I'm cautiously hopeful that together, and I'll say, in struggle, we have struggled together. The Palestine Solidarity Movement is a multiracial, multinational, right? Multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multilingual movement in so many ways. And we actually are producing a shared understanding together, I think, that helps us understand the way that anti-Semitism is actually being reanimated, oddly, through these accusations of anti-Semitism that have come against the Palestine Solidarity Movement. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And I'm really sorry if you heard me interrupting you. My internet dropped out. And I thought you were frozen, but it was actually my internet that decided that it didn't want to work anymore. So luckily, two of us are recording this event, because on my end there will be an interruption to your very important words. Luckily, I wasn't out for too long. So it's 7:15. I think we could definitely go on longer. However, I think we agreed to hold this to about an hour and a half. There are some questions that have been already posed. And if anybody else has questions that they would like to ask, then please feel free either to type them in the Q&A, which again, you can find by clicking more at the bottom of the screen, or you can also use the chat if you like. So while people who are thinking of their questions, perhaps I'll read out the question that's in the Q&A from Travis. Travis says, I wrote an op-ed for a local newspaper talking about the misuse of anti-Semitism, in quotes, from my perspective as an anti-Zionist Jew. I got pushed back because I have a, quote, fringe position that does not reflect the majority of local Jewish opinion. I would appreciate insight on how to address that type of response. I think many of us are receiving that. And in fact, the definition that I spoke about earlier, that's been adopted by the body Universities Australia, says with no evidence that the majority of Jewish people identify as Zionist. And we've already seen Zionism being touted as a protected identity category and people being disciplined on that basis. So would anybody, we probably don't have the space for everybody to address this, but maybe Barry, you'd like to answer this?
Yeah, I could start off at least. I would say, Travis, that your experience, I think, is one that's been shared by so many of us on this call, whether we're presenting or not. I mean, what we see in and just what Alana has said, they are the ones who are actually equating Judaism and Zionism, and then they weaponize that against us for making that same assumption. I mean, I think the answer may be twofold. One is that you keep pressing and you keep trying, right? I mean, the newspaper that you're writing for probably suffers from so many of the same institutional, structural, foundational limits, like of our universities. So they're embedded in a certain set of interests, just as we saw with Jeff Bezos's decision with the Washington Post. It happens on these large presses and these smaller ones, but we have to keep on pushing, right? Some of it may be, to try to make the point more stronger, right? If you're working within organizations, right, works on behalf of that institution, that's a more practical tip. I'll say, like, the vast majority of op-eds that I write never see the light of day. I think, it's a very similar thing. But every now and then, something comes through. I think, again, in practical terms, if you can make it really topical to a particular policy shift or policy change. I think that, newspapers like to have letters that come in that are in response to stories that they themselves have published and not sort of general concerns raised by their readers. All that may increase your chances. But, I think it's necessary for all of us to keep doing that work, even if that work doesn't see the light of day. The act of writing, the act of getting those letters out is important, I think, in and of itself.
Alana, can I just add something to this? Obviously I'm not Jewish and I haven't experienced this, but I think I can speak to it just a little bit. One thing that I think is very important, which also Brooke brought up earlier, is this idea of how problematic it is to homogenize any community, right? Not just the Jewish community, but anyone, really. Like, not all Palestinians have the same values or beliefs, or, like, we're much more complex as human beings than all having the same characteristics, and all of that. And that's something that even with our discussion within the school system, whenever we talk to them, they're like, oh, we want to hear from both sides. And I always tell them there is no both sides. There's like multiple sides within the, one side. And I think that's really important. And I think actually your voice now is more important than ever, especially when there's this push around no, all Jews, identify with Israel, is a really problematic issue. And the more we, punch holes into that argument, the better. And I've found that difficult within my own community, where I'm like, you need to talk to non-Zionist Jews, and our school system was telling me, we bring them to us. We don't know that we would have no connections with any. And I'm like, and actually it has been somewhat true, unfortunately, where I live, but I think that's important because, and I think it's important at every level. So even if it's not just writing the article, but, I think obviously articles in the media are one way, but just connecting to the wider community and really saying, no, there's another perspective here is super, super important.
100%. And I think, the violence of forcing all Jews into identification with Zionism and with Israel is really telling us we stand for settler colonialism and genocide. Zionism doesn't mean anything else, and it has never meant anything else. From my perspective, the whole idea that you can distinguish between different forms of Zionism, to me, is completely erroneous and actually really dangerous. Okay, I have another question in the chat from Holly, who asks, what advice would you give for individuals conversing with loved ones who use Christian Zionism to defend and justify the colonization of Palestine? And she gives a little bit of detail about her mother, who has these beliefs, but at the same time is very critical of Netanyahu's government, settler violence, and the devastating number of Palestinian deaths. But her interpretation of the Bible is seemingly stopping her from recognizing the right of return for the Palestinian people. Perhaps, Aline? I don't know. I don't want to put that on you. It's a very difficult conversation, but maybe you have some ideas. Anybody else also?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that one. I think that one is really difficult and it's tricky. And I think actually it's a really important question because it's also very true that there are so many Christian Zionists, right? Like there are actually probably more Christian Zionists than Jewish Zionists, especially in the US. And unfortunately, I think they're also the ones with those racist ideas, right? And probably have racist ideas towards other communities as well. It's hard because I think when you have an ideology and you so full-heartedly believe in it and I think in a situation like this, even maybe bringing up Christian Palestinians isn't very useful. I don't know, but I feel like maybe with some Christian, it depends on how far right they are, but with some of them it could work. But I think it's also problematic because then you're saying, oh, but there are Christian Palestinians, so you should care. And I think that's problematic because I think people should care regardless, to what someone's background is. But I wonder if, like in a case like this, it's useful to offer, different interpretations of the Bible. I mean, obviously, within the Palestinian tradition, we have liberation theology is a huge part of, Palestinian Christian tradition. So organizations like Sabil and Sabil North America are maybe organizations to point her to, so that, she can look at the Christian tradition from that perspective, from the liberation theology perspective, could be useful. I mean, it depends, because you can't approach everyone from the same angle. But I feel like when it's a family member, it's actually more difficult sometimes, but it's also really important, right? So yeah, I would suggest maybe some of those like alternative Christian theology, perspectives that are really rooted in liberation theology, which also focus on the importance of caring for communities, regardless of their background.
Yeah, that was really helpful and useful. Does anybody else on the panel want to answer, Holly, or should we?
Can I just add a quick
Yeah,
piece,
Barry, go ahead.
if I could, without revealing too much family information? I actually contend with this on a regular basis with a fairly close family member who I love very much, and we have decided to just have a policy of non-engagement. I think that this family member is very, very set in their ways, and I personally just made the choice, like, that's not the person whose opinion I need to change in order to affect some types of difference in the world. I don't want to use this person as sort of practice for my arguments. And so I focus my efforts elsewhere. I don't think that's probably a very good solution, but have very, very few actual family members. We have a very small family, and the idea of losing more is just too painful personally for me to go down that road. And so it's just an area of our lives we just don't talk about, you know. And that's a decision that we've had to make, unfortunately. And I think it's a reflection of just how hard these issues can be at times, and how they intersect at the family level. The macro and the micro all kind of come together in these very, very challenging ways. Yeah, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Yes, this is a very painful area. So many people have lost family members, including parents and children. I mean, that close over this issue, which obviously places people in positions of extreme, pain, personal pain and loss. And people are grieving for that loss, in addition to grieving for the thousands and thousands of people whose lives have been ended. So it's 3 minutes to our time. There was another question in the chat, but I think that Brooke, you have answered that. Of course, it's about how to defend students from criminalization. So many of us are dealing directly with these issues, and it does depend on the jurisdiction that you're in. It does depend on the case-by-case basis. And internationally, obviously, that's different, but it is something that's, that we're, in addition to everything else that we have to do in our regular work, and also in our activism, we also having to try to stop the criminalization of students. The collusion between universities and the police is something that we've seen. Does anybody want to make a quick comment on that?
I mean, I know we're at time, but I just want to say quickly that one thing that I think might be useful and broadly is just this pivot to understand that students are under attack, that it isn't about saying, oh, they said the wrong thing, we're really, really sorry, we need to figure out how to apologize for the saying of the wrong thing or the crossing of the line, but just to really recognize that this is an attack, right? And so that's about, again, back to the idea of the weaponization or that kind of counter, that form of counterinsurgency, that these definitions of anti-Semitism or these ideas of Jewish vulnerability to unsafety, the way that they're circulating is to form an attack. They're not good faith efforts to stop anti-Semitism. That's not what's happening. And I just hope that it's helpful for folks to just reframe it that way and recognize that when we see students, these students are under attack, and it is an intentional effort to attack these students, and that's how we have to address these situations. So I hope that that's useful in various contexts, right, for folks.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to second that fact. I mean, obviously, we've seen that first in line are Palestinian, Arab, and Black students and Indigenous students, but also many Jewish students who are coming under direct attack and being accused, students and staff and other people who are being accused of anti-Semitism, often by people who are not Jewish. So this is something that it's not new, but the intensification of it is extreme. And many of us are facing that today. Okay, well, thanks everybody so much for your participation. I think I certainly have learned a lot, and many ideas are firing off in my head from this conversation. I do hope that it's the beginning of more of these types of conversations. Once again, thank you to Barry for sort of coming up with the idea, the framing idea for the event. And we finally made it after quite a long time of trying to plan this. Thank you very much to Aline and Brooke for joining us, and to Yulia from the Institute also for being here to support us, and to all of you, of course, today for coming. We're going to be sharing the recording of this on the ICSZ website and our social media, etc. And I do encourage you to share it with your friends and comrades, and hopefully we'll return again for more conversations in the near future. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. The sun has risen here on Gadigal land, so I'm going to start my day. Thank you very much.